Hey folks, this is Rhykker with a video on the new class coming to Lost Ark's Western client next Thursday, the Glaivier. Known as the Lancemaster in other regions, the Glaivier is a highly anticipated class that many players have been waiting to make their main. And thanks to it already having released in Lost Ark's Eastern clients, we actually know quite a bit about this class. I consulted with the Lost Ark experts at maxroll.gg to get the lowdown about the Glaivier. And once the class releases, you'll be able to find full Glaivier leveling guides, PvP guides, Chaos Dungeon, raid guides, everything on maxroll.gg. Now before we start, two quick disclaimers. First, I'm going to try not to mention skill names just because any skill names we know now are just translations, and they're not going to be named the same thing on the Western launch. The skill icons, however, will be the same, so you could go by the skill icons. Second disclaimer, we know the devs had some major class balance changes and reworks coming soon to the Korean test servers, so it's possible that the Western release of the Glaivier will be an updated version, which could impact some of the information we'll go over in this video, but we're not going to get too granular, so it's unlikely that this information will become too outdated, but again, once this fully releases, maxroll.gg, I'll have links in the description to all the guides for all the specifics that you can ever want for this class. So what is the Glaivier? Well, it's a class that belongs to the martial artist archetype. Her key feature is the ability to swap between two different stances, Spear Stance and Glaive Stance, and each has its own set of skills. Spear Stance has skills that are colored red, and it's better at single target damage, quickly taking down bosses, short range attacks, whereas Glaive Stance, whose skills are colored blue, has a lot of area of effect skills, longer range stuff. It's great at dealing with big groups of enemies. And similar to the Gunslinger and the Deadeye, swapping stances when appropriate is a key part of this class's playstyle. However, there's another mechanic at play that actually discourages you from just changing stances constantly. You see, as you stay and fight in one stance, you fill up a gauge, which has 3 buff levels. Once you change stance, you then gain the buffs based on the buff level you reached. So if you didn't even reach buff level 1 and you change stance, then you gain no buffs at all. If you reach buff level 3 and then you change stance, you're going to gain the maximum buff. The buffs differ based on what stance you're in, and ideal play with the Glaivier will generally revolve around constantly maintaining your buffs. That is, you fill up your gauge, change stance, gain the buff, and by the time that buff expires, you will have once again filled up your gauge and you're ready to swap again. This means that when you're picking skills for your build, you have to keep in mind your ability to swap between stances relatively quickly. You can't just stack on one stance super long cooldowns, because then you're going to be waiting and you're not going to be able to build up your buffs. Now, the Glavier's 2 awakening skills play into the same stance mentality. Her blue awakening skill takes a moment to charge up, and then it deals a high amount of damage in a huge area. And the other, the red awakening skill, is a channeled skill. You could also instacast it, and it's often the choice for taking down an enemy player in PvP. It's pretty much the PvP awakening skill you take. And depending on the situation, you could start to channel and then preemptively end the channel depending on what's going on. While leveling a Glaivier, a lot of her skills can come in handy due to their decent base damage, so you have a lot of options to go with, especially when combined with the buffs she gets from her identity gauge. Crit and specialization are the optimum combat stats to look for on gear while you're leveling in order to maximize your damage, your clear speed, but of course, item level trumps everything. Your glaive skills will be your bread and butter while leveling, since they focus on area damage, and you have a good number of options of skills to pick from here. You do eventually, however, as you're getting higher in levels, want to invest in a couple good single target burst damage skills as well. That's where the spear skills come in handy. For the precise gameplay, you're rotating through your skills, charging up your identity gauge to get damage, speed, and crit buffs. And it's especially important that when you want to use your red skills, that you have built up your level 3 buff before that, because that gives you a crit damage buff. And red skills basically crit all the time, or you can build them to crit all the time. So take a skill that crits all the time and give it a crit damage buff. Yeah, that's a nice combo. In fact, that's something that makes the Glaivier particularly powerful in any kind of gear equalized content. Other classes need to invest into crit chance, but the Glaivier doesn't. And thus it can afford to stack more damage where other classes are stacking crit. We've seen in other regions multiple Glaiviers in one party carry someone through equalized content, which is a big reason to think that that aspect may be reworked to address that. In PvP, the Glaivier is pretty solid. She has lots of mobility, crowd control options, and high push immunity. You see, in Lost Ark, you have 3 tiers of crowd control immunity. Push immunity is tier 2. which makes you immune to interrupts, which would be just tier 1, and displacements. And the Glaivier can maintain a good amount of uptime on this push immunity. In the current PvP meta, which heavily revolves around crowd control, these are great assets. Her playstyle is very aggressive. You look for an opportunity to engage, you pop in, apply crowd control, deal some good damage, and get out before you're killed. This incredible mobility lets her engage and escape easily. She's not as squishy as some of the other high mobility classes. She can bring down enough damage to nuke an enemy if really necessary, taking out those red skills. She even has a counterattack ability, which, if used properly, is huge and a rare thing in this game. In fact, on paper, the Glaivier has the strongest PvP kit, but it's one thing to have the tools at your disposal, it's another to actually execute with them. So knowing when to swap stances, when to engage, who to engage, when to pull back, when to nuke, understanding the counters, these are critical to performing well in PvP. And oftentimes your job on your team isn't to jump in and assassinate, but rather to jump in and disrupt. You cause chaos, and then you pop off onto another target and disrupt him. And unlike PvE, building up your identity gauge is less important in PvP. You're going to be changing stances very often. You're not going to have the luxury to fully build up your buffs. For running chaos dungeons, you want to focus on big area of effect skills with low cooldowns to clear the content as quickly as possible. You want to lure enemies together, get them into a pack, burst them down with all your area of effect damage skills, all your blue skills in that glaive stance. Then when fighting elites and bosses, there's this one blue skill you want to use at the start of your rotation. This is the icon to look for. The translated name is Shackling Blue Dragon. It's going to be something different in the Western launch, but what it does is it makes your subsequent attacks against that target have higher crit rate. And remember, on red skills you don't need crit rate because you're always critting. So to get the most out of this skill, you want to cast it at the very start of your blue rotation, so that it buffs all your blue skills. Then whenever you see a pack of elites that are close together, use your awakening skill. When you kill an elite, you get 40% cooldown reduction on your awakening, and when you kill a boss, you refresh it entirely, so you can be a lot more liberal in your use of your awakening. For raids, the Glaivier has 2 viable class engravings. Again, the names will change, but one engraving, which we'll call Control, locks you out of your spear stance entirely. You go full-on Glaivier. Now, this engraving buffs the damage of your blue skills, and this subsequently also makes the class much easier to play. You don't have to deal with any kind of stance management. But because you don't get access to the buffs from the identity gauge, this means you need to rely on gear and engravings to get crit rate. This build also needs to focus on stacking swiftness to get as much cooldown reduction as possible to be able to spam your blue skills, because now you have a whole bunch of skills that you're being locked out of, and whereas previously you could have afforded to have longer cooldowns because you're going through more skills, well, now you have a tighter skill rotation. Now, not only does taking this engraving drop your mobility, but it also has you forfeit a key defensive tool of the Glaivier, which is a spear skill, which is basically a panic defense tool. This means that you have to be a lot more careful in reserving your spacebar as an escape. You don't want that to be on cooldown when you need it. Then the other engraving, which we'll call Pinnacle, uses both spear and glaive skills, and its gameplay revolves around getting your level 3 identity buffs before changing stance, since this engraving enhances those buffs. And you have a lot of viable skills for this build. The main stat priority you want to go for here is Specialization, because it increases the effectiveness of your identity buffs. Now, this build does, however, lack diversity in what engravings it can go for. Because you don't need crit, you want to go for general damage increase engravings. And there aren't a whole lot to choose from, other than the less player-friendly options like Grudge and Cursed Doll. Then for group play, talking about group synergies specifically, the Glaivier, with that skill we were talking about before, that blue skill, you're able to buff the party's crit chance basically by hitting an enemy and making that enemy more susceptible to crits. So in an ideal party composition, you want to have different characters bringing different kinds of party synergy bonuses. Now, as a reminder, folks, maxroll.gg is going to have all the Glaivier guides you can possibly want. It'll all be up to date. It's going to have all the proper English names of skills, and if there are any changes to the Korean version, that's all going to be updated as well. I'm going to drop a bunch of links in the description when this class launches, which again, next Thursday, the 21st of April. If you're just getting into Lost Ark and are having trouble picking a class, be sure to check out this video over here, as well as our fast leveling guide, so that you can catch up to your friends when you make a new character. And check out this guide on upgrading your gear. This is a guide on how to get your gear from beginner level to end game level. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch, Patreon, and YouTube supporters for making these videos possible. If you like what you see on this channel and want to support the creation of more content, you can consider pledging on YouTube or Patreon and unlocking behind-the-scenes content, monthly virtual hangouts, and more. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, check out these other videos, and subscribe to join Rhykker's Raiders for more gaming content.